When Eli Mercer inherited his grandfather's mansion, the whole town laughed. The once magnificent estate was nothing but charred beams and ash-covered memories, destroyed in a fire nobody wanted to discuss. With his construction business failing and his 12-year-old son losing faith in their future, Eli had every reason to walk away from the blackened ruins. But as he stood among the wreckage, something caught his eye, a corner of yellowed paper peeking through a scorched wall. That single page would lead him to a series of hidden journals, cryptic maps, and a secret that had been buried for over 50 years. His grandfather hadn't just been a wealthy businessman. He'd been hiding something worth $200 million, stashed away during the most dangerous time in the South's history. But here's what nobody saw coming. What would Eli discover about his family's past that would change not just his life, but an entire community's understanding of justice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Eli Mercer had been sitting in his truck outside the Millbrook Elementary School, watching his son Danny walk slowly toward the pickup line. The boy's backpack hung heavy on his thin shoulders, and his head was down in that way that told Eli everything he needed to know about how the day had gone. At 12, Danny was already carrying burdens no child should bear, the weight of unpaid bills. The whispers of classmates whose parents talked too freely about the Mercer family's troubles, and the growing understanding that his father's construction business was failing. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Eli rolled down the window and called out softly, "Hey, buddy, how was school?" Danny climbed into the passenger seat and buckled his seatbelt with the mechanical precision of routine. "Fine," he said, though his voice carried the flatness that had become all too familiar since Sarah left them 2 years ago. She'd taken nothing but her clothes and her disappointment, leaving behind a house that felt too large and too quiet, filled with the echoes of arguments about money and dreams that never quite materialized. "Just fine," Eli pressed gently, pulling away from the school and joining the procession of SUVs and minivans driven by parents whose biggest worry was whether to pack organic apple slices or string cheese in tomorrow's lunch. Danny stared out the window at the passing neighborhoods, neat lawns, painted shutters, driveways with 2 cars instead of one rusted pickup held together by prayer and stubbornness. "Tommy Harrison said his dad heard at the hardware store that we might have to move." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd been careful, so careful, to shield Danny from the worst of their financial troubles. But in a town like Millbrook, Georgia, population 847, secrets had a way of becoming public knowledge faster than kudzu could overtake a fence line. "Tommy Harrison's dad talks too much," Eli said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We're not moving anywhere, son. This is our home." But even as he said it, Eli knew the words rang hollow. The bank had already sent 2 notices about the mortgage, and his last 3 construction jobs had fallen through when clients discovered his reputation had been tarnished by one project that went sideways, a kitchen renovation where the homeowner had paid up front and then disappeared with Eli's materials and labor investment. Word traveled fast in small towns, and trust, once broken, was harder to rebuild than any foundation. They pulled into the driveway of their modest ranch house on Sycamore Street. The lawn needed mowing, and the gutters still held autumn leaves from last season, but it was theirs. Or at least it had been, until the medical bills from Danny's emergency appendectomy the previous spring had pushed them past the point of careful budgeting into the realm of choosing between groceries and utilities. That evening, as Eli sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and calculator batteries that had died weeks ago, the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, and his first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. Creditors had a way of calling during dinner time. But something made him pick up on the 4th ring. "Mr. Mercer, this is Harrison Blackwell from Blackwell Morrison Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandfather, Jeremiah Mercer. Eli's hand tightened on the phone. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather in 15 years. Not since the old man had made his feelings clear about Eli's choice to marry Sarah and start a family instead of finishing college. Jeremiah Mercer had been a successful businessman, the kind of man who wore three-piece suits even to the grocery store and measured worth in quarterly profits rather than quality time. I wasn't aware my grandfather had passed, Eli said carefully. 3 weeks ago, I'm afraid. He left specific instructions that you were to be contacted only after the funeral arrangements were complete. There's a matter of inheritance that requires your immediate attention. The word inheritance sent a spark of hope through Eli's chest, quickly dampened by reality. His grandfather had never approved of anything Eli had done with his life. Any inheritance was likely to be symbolic at best, perhaps the old family Bible or a few shares of stock worth less than the taxes owed on them. What kind of inheritance? Eli asked. The family estate on Magnolia Hill Road, all 47 acres, including the main house and outbuildings. I'll need you to sign some papers, of course, but it's yours, free and clear. Eli nearly dropped the phone. The Mercer estate had been the talk of Millbrook for decades, a sprawling antebellum mansion surrounded by oak trees older than the Civil War itself. Jeremiah had inherited it from his own grandfather and had spent a fortune maintaining it through the years. Property taxes alone must have been substantial. There's one complication, the lawyer continued, and Eli's brief moment of elation began to fade. There was a fire 6 months ago. Extensive damage, I'm afraid. The structure is, well, it's not habitable. That night, after Danny had gone to bed, Eli drove out to Magnolia Hill Road for the first time in decades. The wrought iron gates that had once welcomed visitors to the Mercer estate now stood open, their hinges rusted and hanging at odd angles. The long driveway, once lined with perfectly manicured azaleas, was overgrown with weeds that scraped against his truck's undercarriage. When the mansion came into view, Eli had to stop the truck and sit in the darkness, processing what he was seeing. The house that had dominated Millbrook's skyline for over a century was now a skeleton of its former self. The elegant columns that had supported the wraparound porch were blackened stumps, and the roof had collapsed in several places, leaving gaping holes that looked like wounds against the night sky. He walked slowly toward the ruins, his footsteps crunching on debris that had once been hand-carved moldings and imported marble. The smell of old smoke still lingered in the air, mixed with the musty scent of rain-soaked wood and the beginnings of decay. Whatever had happened here had been thorough and devastating. The front door was gone entirely, leaving an opening that led into what had once been a grand foyer. Eli pulled out his phone's flashlight and stepped carefully across the threshold. The chandelier that had once welcomed guests to elegant dinner parties now lay in pieces across warped floorboards. Family portraits that had watched over generations of Mercers were nothing but empty frames and ashes. But as Eli moved deeper into the ruins, something caught his eye. In what had been the library, where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves had once held first editions and family histories, a section of the wall had partially collapsed, revealing the space behind it. And there, caught between two charred studs, was a corner of what looked like yellowed paper. Eli carefully extracted the page, which appeared to be from some kind of journal or ledger. The handwriting was his grandfather's. He recognized the precise, old-fashioned script from birthday cards and the occasional formal letter. But the words made no sense in the context of what he knew about Jeremiah Mercer. The packages arrived safely at the northern stations, one entry read. 17 souls found freedom this month. Praise be to God. The railroad runs smooth despite the watchers. Another entry, dated 3 months later. Must be more careful. Sheriff asking questions about the midnight deliveries. Moved the main cache to the old root cellar. Coordinates 34.5 degrain, 83.2 degrazed. The cause is greater than any one man's safety. Eli read the entries twice, then a third time, his heart beginning to race. Underground Railroad, packages, souls finding freedom. His grandfather, the stern businessman who had never shown the slightest interest in social justice or civil rights, had apparently been involved in something far more dangerous and meaningful than quarterly profit reports. The final entry on the visible portion of the page was dated 1963. The money is secured. Future generations will understand what we did here, what we sacrificed. The map is hidden where only family blood will think to look. Let them know we were not just businessmen, we were freedom fighters. As Eli stood in the ruins of his family's legacy, holding a piece of paper that seemed to rewrite everything he thought he knew about his heritage, he heard a car engine approaching down the overgrown driveway. Headlights swept across the damaged walls, and he quickly folded the journal page and slipped it into his jacket pocket. A police cruiser pulled to a stop near his truck, and Officer Frank Morrison, a man Eli had known since high school, climbed out with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who'd been dealing with trespassers and vandals for months. "Evening, Eli," Frank said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Heard you inherited this place. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Eli replied. "Just came out to see what I'm dealing with." Frank nodded and swept his flashlight across the ruins. "Fire started around midnight on a Tuesday in March. Nobody knows exactly how. Your grandfather was visiting his sister in Atlanta, so nobody was hurt, thank the Lord. But the damage, well, you can see for yourself. Any idea what caused it?" "Officially, electrical fire, probably old wiring. But between you and me," Frank lowered his voice and stepped closer, "there were some folks who weren't too happy about some of the things your grandfather was saying in his final years. He'd gotten involved with that historical society, started talking about setting the record straight on some old stories. Some folks around here prefer their history to stay buried." As Frank drove away, leaving Eli alone with the ruins and the mysterious journal page, a new understanding began to take shape. His inheritance wasn't just a burned-out shell of a house. It was a puzzle, a mystery that connected his family to something much larger and more significant than he'd ever imagined. And somewhere in these ashes lay the key to not just understanding his grandfather's secret life, but possibly to securing Danny's future in ways he'd never dared to hope. The pocket watch he'd found near the journal page felt heavy in his other pocket, an antique timepiece with coordinates engraved on the back that matched the ones in the journal entry. As he walked back to his truck, Eli made a decision that would change everything. He would not sell the property to developers, despite the financial relief it would bring. He would uncover whatever truth his grandfather had died protecting, even if it meant risking what little stability he had left. Back home, Danny was still awake, reading by lamplight in his bedroom. When Eli looked in to say goodnight, his son looked up from his book with eyes that held too much understanding for a 12-year-old. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" For the first time in months, Eli felt a genuine smile cross his face. "You know what, son? I think we might be better than okay. How would you like to help your old dad solve a mystery?" The next Saturday morning arrived grey and overcast, with the kind of thick humidity that promised afternoon thunderstorms. Eli had loaded his truck with salvage tools, work gloves, and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Danny sat beside him, clutching a notebook and pen with the serious determination of a detective about to solve his first case. "Tell me again what the journal page said," Danny asked as they turned onto Magnolia Hill Road. Eli had shown his son the yellowed paper the night before, watching the boy's eyes light up with the first genuine excitement he'd seen in months. Danny had always been drawn to puzzles and mysteries, spending hours with library books about famous unsolved cases and historical enigmas. This was better than any book. This was family history wrapped in genuine intrigue. Something about packages arriving at northern stations and 17 souls finding freedom, Eli repeated, and coordinates that match the numbers on your great-grandfather's pocket watch. They parked near the mansion ruins, and Danny immediately began photographing everything with his father's old digital camera. The boy had insisted on documenting their investigation properly, creating what he called evidence files for each discovery. Eli watched his son work with methodical precision, and for the first time in years, felt proud of the young man Danny was becoming. "Dad, look at this!" Danny called from near the collapsed library wall. He was crouched beside the exposed interior structure, pointing to something Eli had missed in the darkness of his first visit. "There's more paper in here, but it's stuck behind this beam." Eli carefully pried away a section of charred wood, revealing a small metal box wedged between the wall studs. Inside were more journal pages and, wrapped in oiled cloth, a black and white photograph that took his breath away. The image showed his grandfather as a much younger man, maybe in his 30s, standing alongside a group of well-dressed African-American men and women. Everyone in the photo was smiling, but there was something in their eyes that spoke of shared danger and purpose. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, "Freedom Riders Meeting, Atlanta 1963, J. Mercer, Financial Coordinator." Below that, in his grandfather's precise handwriting, "The money flows where justice demands. Future generations must know we were not bystanders." Danny studied the photograph with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "Dad, this changes everything we thought we knew about Great-Grandpa, doesn't it?" "It sure does, son." Eli sat heavily on a piece of debris that had once been an elegant banister. "Your great-grandfather always seemed so distant, so focused on business and profit. I never imagined he was involved in anything like civil rights work." "Maybe that was the point," Danny said thoughtfully. "Maybe he had to act like he didn't care about these things so people wouldn't suspect what he was really doing." The wisdom in his 12-year-old son's observation struck Eli with unexpected force. How many assumptions had he made about his own family, his own legacy, based on surface appearances? How many other secrets lay buried beneath years of misunderstanding? They spent the rest of the morning carefully searching through the ruins, uncovering fragments of what appeared to be a deliberately hidden archive. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of Jeremiah Mercer's secret life receipts for large cash donations to civil rights organizations, coded correspondence with activists, and detailed records of what could only be described as an underground financial network. But it was Danny who made the most significant discovery, in a section of the mansion's foundation that had been protected from the worst of the fire damage. Wedged beneath a loose stone was a hand-drawn map fragment showing the layout of the estate property, with X marks at various locations and cryptic notations in the margins. "It's like a treasure map," Danny breathed, his eyes wide with excitement. "That's exactly what it is," Eli realized, studying the careful markings. "But the treasure isn't gold or jewels. It's something your great-grandfather considered far more valuable." As they prepared to leave, a black sedan pulled up behind Eli's truck. Two men in expensive suits got out, moving with the calculated confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. The older man, silver-haired and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, approached with his hand extended. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Richard Caldwell from Caldwell Development Corporation. This is my associate, James Patterson. We understand you've recently inherited this property." Eli shook the offered hand cautiously, noting the man's soft palm and manicured nails hands that had never swung a hammer or mixed concrete. "That's right. We'd like to make you an offer for the land, a very generous offer, considering the condition of the structures." Caldwell gestured toward the ruins with barely concealed distaste. $500,000 cash, closing within 2 weeks. The number hit Eli like a physical blow. $500,000 would solve every financial problem he faced, secure Danny's future, allow them to start fresh somewhere new. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having at once. But Danny stepped closer to his father, the map fragment clutched protectively in his small hands. "We're not selling," the boy said firmly. "This is our family's history." Caldwell's smile tightened slightly. Son, I understand family sentiment, but sentiment doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. Your father has responsibilities. My father has the right to make his own decisions about our family's property. Danny interrupted, his voice carrying a strength that reminded Eli powerfully of his own father at that age. And we're not interested. Patterson, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Mr. Mercer, perhaps you should consider the practical aspects of this situation. Property taxes on 47 acres, insurance costs, liability issues keeping this land could bankrupt you. We're offering a solution to all your problems. How did you know about my financial situation? Eli asked, his protective instincts suddenly alert. Small town, Caldwell said with a shrug. Word gets around. We're simply trying to help a neighbor in need. But something in the man's tone suggested this wasn't neighborly concern. These men had come prepared with detailed knowledge of Eli's circumstances, armed with an offer calculated to be irresistible to a desperate man. They wanted this land badly, and that raised uncomfortable questions about what they might know that Eli didn't. After the developers left, Eli and Danny sat in the truck for a long moment, processing what had just happened. The offer was still real, still tempting, still a potential solution to all their immediate problems. But the photograph in Danny's notebook and the map fragment in Eli's pocket whispered of something far more valuable than money, the truth about who they really were and who they could become. Dad, Danny's voice was quiet but determined. Great-grandpa hid these things for a reason, didn't he? He wanted us to find them, to understand what he really did with his life. Eli started the truck and began the drive home, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers. I think you're right, son. I think he left us a message that took 50 years to deliver, so we're going to keep looking, even though those men offered us all that money. Eli reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder, feeling something shift inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. We're going to keep looking, because some things are worth more than money, and some stories need to be told, no matter how long they've been buried. As they drove through downtown Millbrook, Eli noticed things he'd never paid attention to before the Confederate monument in the town square. The complete absence of any acknowledgement of the African-American families who had lived and worked in the community for generations, the subtle but persistent segregation that still existed in social circles and neighborhood boundaries. His grandfather hadn't just been hiding money. He'd been hiding the truth about what kind of man he really was, and what kind of community Millbrook could become if people were brave enough to face their history honestly. The real treasure wasn't buried gold or hidden cash. It was the opportunity to finish what Jeremiah Mercer had started decades ago, when courage was measured not in dollars, but in the willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a Carnegie building from 1903, its red brick facade and arched windows giving it the dignified appearance of an institution that took knowledge seriously. Eli and Danny had spent the better part of Monday afternoon in the local history section, surrounded by dusty volumes and microfilm readers that seemed older than the building itself. Sarah Matthews, the head librarian, had been watching them work for over an hour before finally approaching their table. She was a woman in her early 50s, with graying auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of intelligent eyes that suggested she knew more than she typically shared. "Researching the Mercer family?" she asked, gesturing toward the stack of historical documents Danny had been photographing with meticulous care. "Something like that," Eli replied cautiously. Word traveled fast in Millbrook, and he wasn't sure how much attention he wanted to draw to their investigation. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down without being invited, the gesture of someone comfortable with her authority in this particular domain. "I'm Sarah Matthews. I've been the head librarian here for 23 years, and before that, I was working on my doctorate in Southern history at the University of Georgia. The Mercer family has always been one of my research interests." Danny looked up from his notebook with obvious excitement. "You know about our family?" More than most people realize, Sarah said with a smile that held secrets. Your great-grandfather was a fascinating man. Publicly, he was known as a successful businessman who kept to himself. But there were always rumors, stories that didn't quite add up, financial records that suggested his money was going places that didn't match his public persona. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a manila folder, thick with photocopied documents. I've been collecting information about the Underground Railroad activities in this region for years. Georgia had more active routes than most people realize, especially in the 1950s and 60s when the civil rights movement was gaining momentum. 1. Eli felt his pulse quicken. Are you saying my grandfather was involved in Underground Railroad activities? I'm saying the evidence strongly suggests it, though he was very careful to leave no obvious trail. Sarah opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Look at this bank records from 1962 showing regular large withdrawals from your grandfather's business account, always in cash, always on the same day of the month. And here, she pointed to a newspaper clipping, reports of mysterious nighttime deliveries to properties along old logging roads in the county. No one ever saw what was being delivered or who was doing the delivering. Danny studied a hand-drawn map that Sarah had included in her research files. The map showed the counties surrounding Millbrook, with red lines connecting various points and small notations in the margins. It looked remarkably similar to the fragment they'd found in the mansion ruins, but this version was more complete, showing connections that extended far beyond the immediate area. This map, Danny said, his voice tight with excitement, it's like the one we found, but there are more details. Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. You found a map in the mansion ruins? Eli made a quick decision, pulling out the photograph and map fragment from his jacket pocket. Sarah examined both items with the focused intensity of a scholar who had just discovered a missing piece of a puzzle she'd been working on for decades. This is extraordinary, she breathed. This photograph, I recognize two of these men. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s inner circle used to meet in Atlanta to coordinate financial support for freedom riders and voter registration drives. If your grandfather was their financial coordinator, he was involved at the highest levels of the civil rights movement. But why would he keep it secret? Eli asked. Even after all these years? Sarah's expression grew somber. Because some secrets are still dangerous, even 50 years later. There are people in this community whose families profited from keeping things the way they were. There are businesses that were built on the foundation of keeping certain populations powerless and disenfranchised. Your grandfather's activities would have threatened a lot of powerful interests. She pulled out another document, a property survey from 1961 that showed the original boundaries of the Mercer estate. Look at this. Your grandfather owned not just the mansion and immediate grounds, but a network of properties throughout the county. Farmhouses, abandoned mills, even a few properties in town that most people assumed belonged to other families. Danny traced the property boundaries with his finger, comparing them to the map fragment they'd discovered. Dad, these locations match the X marks on our map. Great-grandpa owned all these places? Owned them and used them, Sarah confirmed. Safe houses, meeting points, storage locations. He created an entire infrastructure to support the movement, hiding it behind legitimate business transactions and property investments. As they studied the documents, a clearer picture began to emerge of Jeremiah Mercer's double life. By day, he was a conservative businessman who attended the right social functions and maintained the appropriate public relationships. But by night, he was financing and coordinating one of the most extensive underground railroad networks in the Southeast. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I've heard stories unconfirmed but persistent about money. Large amounts of money that were collected from donors up north and never quite made it to their intended destinations. Some people assumed it was stolen or lost. But what if it wasn't? What if it was deliberately hidden, saved for a time when it could do the most good? The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. The $200 million mentioned in the original journal entry wasn't just family savings or business profits. It was civil rights money, contributions from supporters across the country who had believed they were funding the fight for justice and equality. But where would he hide that kind of money? Eli asked. Sarah smiled and pointed to the coordinates written on both the photograph and the map fragment. That's what you need to figure out. Those numbers aren't random, they're precise locations, marked for a reason. Danny had been quiet during this exchange, but now he looked up with the kind of determined expression that reminded Eli powerfully of his own childhood stubbornness. We have to find it, don't we? Not just for us, but for all the people who donated that money expecting it to help make things better. It's not going to be easy, Sarah warned. If I'm right about this, there are people who would do almost anything to prevent this money from being found. People who have spent 50 years benefiting from the status quo, who see any change as a threat to their way of life. As if summoned by her words, the library's front door chimed, and Richard Caldwell from the development company walked in, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on Eli's table. He approached with the same calculated smile from their previous encounter, but there was something harder in his expression now, a subtle shift that suggested patience wearing thin. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure their conversation wouldn't go unnoticed by other library patrons. "Still playing archaeologist in the ruins, I see. I hope you're being careful out there. Old buildings can be dangerous, especially for children." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Eli felt his protective instincts surge. "My son and I can take care of ourselves." "Of course," Caldwell agreed. "But accidents happen. It would be terrible if someone got hurt exploring property that should probably just be cleared and developed into something useful for the community." After he left, Sarah gathered her documents with hands that trembled slightly. "He's right about one thing, this is dangerous, but not for the reasons he thinks." That evening, armed with Sarah's research and a borrowed metal detector from her ex-husband's garage, Eli and Danny returned to the estate under cover of darkness. The coordinates from the pocket watch had been gnawing at Eli's mind all afternoon, 34.5 degrees, 83.2 W numbers that placed them somewhere on the property, but without more precise instruments, finding the exact location would require old-fashioned detective work. Danny had brought a camping lantern and his notebook, determined to document every step of their investigation. "Dad, if we're looking for something great-grandpa hid 60 years ago, wouldn't it be underground?" "Most likely," Eli agreed, sweeping the metal detector across a patch of ground near the mansion's foundation. But remember, he had to make sure it could be found by family members who might not have sophisticated equipment. It would need to be hidden, but not impossible to locate. They worked in systematic grid patterns, covering the areas around the mansion first, before expanding outward toward the old oak trees that had witnessed decades of family history. It was slow, methodical work, interrupted frequently by false alarms, buried bottles, old farm equipment, and the occasional coin that had been lost by children playing in what had once been carefully maintained gardens. Around 10 o'clock, the metal detector's signal changed tone near a massive oak tree that stood about 50 yards from the mansion ruins. The tree was ancient, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches spreading out like arms that had embraced generations of Mercers during family gatherings and summer barbecues. "Dad, there's something here," Danny said, pointing to an area where the ground seemed slightly different from the surrounding soil. "The grass grows different right here, like something's been disturbed and then covered over." Eli knelt and examined the area more closely. Danny was right. There was a subtle depression in the earth, roughly rectangular in shape, that suggested deliberate excavation at some point in the past. But more importantly, carved into the oak tree's bark about 3 feet above ground level, weathered by decades but still visible, were the initials J.M. 1963, and below them, an arrow pointing directly at the disturbed ground. "Your great-grandfather marked it," Eli breathed. "He wanted to make sure the right person could find this place." They began digging carefully, using hand tools to avoid damaging whatever might be buried. About 2 feet down, Danny's trowel struck something that rang with a metallic sound. Working together, they uncovered a metal box about the size of a briefcase, its surface green with age but still intact. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth and plastic, were blueprints, detailed architectural drawings of the mansion and surrounding buildings, but these weren't standard construction plans. They showed hidden passages, concealed rooms, and what appeared to be an extensive tunnel network running beneath the entire property. "Dad, look at this," Danny whispered, studying one of the blueprints by lantern light. "There are tunnels everywhere under this place. And look here, this room under the mansion, it's marked as repository." The tunnel entrances were marked at various locations around the property, hidden in root cellars, old storm drains, and even beneath what had appeared to be decorative garden features. According to the plans, the main entrance was located in the mansion's basement, behind what the blueprints labeled as a concealment panel in the foundation wall. "This is how he did it," Eli realized. "Your great-grandfather didn't just hide money, he built an entire underground facility to support the Underground Railroad. People could travel through these tunnels without ever being seen from the surface." They returned to the mansion ruins and made their way carefully down to what remained of the basement level. Most of the floor had collapsed, but the foundation walls were still largely intact. Using the blueprints as a guide, they located the section of wall marked on the plans and began examining it more closely. Danny found it first a section of stone that protruded slightly from the rest of the wall, worn smooth as if it had been pushed repeatedly over the years. When Eli pressed against it, it moved inward with a grinding sound of stone against stone, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The passage beyond led into darkness, but their flashlight beams revealed hand-carved stone walls and wooden support beams that had survived both time and the fire above. The air was stale but breathable, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else, something that reminded Eli of the basement in his childhood home, where his grandmother had stored preserves and root vegetables. The tunnel extended about 30 yards before opening into a larger chamber carved directly from the bedrock, and there, preserved as if they had been sealed away yesterday, were the contents of Jeremiah Mercer's secret life. The room contained filing cabinets full of documents, boxes of correspondence, and most remarkably, a collection of personal items that told the story of the Underground Railroad in intimate detail. There were quilts that had been used to signal safe houses, photographs of families who had passed through on their way to freedom, and handwritten letters of gratitude from people whose names had been lost to official history, but who lived on in these carefully preserved memories. But it was the modern safe in the corner of the room that drew their immediate attention. Unlike the historical artifacts around it, the safe was clearly from the 1980s or 1990s, installed long after the original Underground Railroad activities had ended. The combination lock required 6 numbers, and Danny immediately tried the coordinates from the pocket watch. The safe opened with a quiet click, revealing contents that took both their breaths away. Stacks of cash, neatly bundled and wrapped in plastic, filled most of the safe's interior. But there were also stock certificates, bonds, property deeds, and a leather journal that appeared to contain detailed financial records spanning several decades. The journal's final entry, dated just 6 months before the mansion fire, was written in Jeremiah's still steady handwriting. "The work continues, though the methods have changed. What began as emergency aid for freedom seekers has grown into something larger, a trust fund for justice, invested and compounded over 50 years. The money belongs not to any one family, but to the cause it was meant to serve. Let those who find this treasure understand their responsibility to use it wisely." A detailed accounting on the following pages showed how the original civil rights donations had been carefully invested and reinvested over the decades. The $200 million mentioned in the first journal entry had grown to nearly $400 million, all of it earmarked for what Jeremiah called the continuing work of justice and reconciliation. As they sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by the hidden history of their family and their community, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a calling, a challenge to continue work that his grandfather had begun in the most dangerous period of the civil rights era. "Danny," he said quietly, "what do you think we should do with all this?" His son looked around the chamber, taking in the quilts and photographs, the letters and artifacts, the testament to courage and sacrifice that had been hidden beneath their feet all along. "I think Great-Grandpa left us instructions," Danny said, pointing to the journal. "He wanted us to continue what he started, but first, we need to understand what that really means." Sarah Matthews arrived at the estate early the next morning, her car loaded with historical research materials and a thermos of coffee strong enough to fuel a full day of investigation. When Eli had called her the previous evening to share their discovery, her voice had trembled with the excitement of a scholar who had just learned that years of theoretical research were about to become concrete reality. She stood at the entrance to the underground chamber like an archaeologist entering a pharaoh's tomb, her eyes wide as she took in the preserved history surrounding them. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, moving carefully among the artifacts. "This is one of the most complete underground railroad archives I've ever seen." Danny had spent the early morning organizing their discoveries, creating what he called a master file that cross-referenced the various documents, photographs, and financial records. His methodical approach reminded Sarah of graduate students she'd worked with, but there was something different about the boy's dedication. This wasn't just academic curiosity, but personal investment in understanding his family's legacy. "Look at this letter," Danny said, carefully handling a piece of correspondence dated 1964. "It's from Dr. King himself, thanking Great-Grandpa for extraordinary financial support during our most challenging moments. And here," he pointed to another document, "a thank you note from Rosa Parks for help with legal expenses during her court cases." Sarah examined the letters with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. "Your grandfather wasn't just supporting the movement, he was one of its most important financial backers." "The amounts mentioned here," she paused, checking figures in several documents. "He was contributing more money than some entire organizations." But it was the bank safety deposit box key they'd found in the tunnel's secondary chamber that represented their next major breakthrough. The key was attached to a small metal tag stamped with the logo of First National Bank of Atlanta, along with a box number and what appeared to be access codes. "We need to get to Atlanta," Eli said, turning the key over in his palm. "Whatever your grandfather stored in that safety deposit box, it's probably the final piece of this puzzle." The drive to Atlanta took 3 hours, giving them time to process the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Sarah rode in the passenger seat, reading aloud from Jeremiah's detailed journals, while Danny documented everything in his notebook from the back seat. "Listen to this entry from March 1965, Sarah said. "The money is no longer just emergency aid. We must think longer term, invest for the future when new challenges will require new solutions. The fight for justice doesn't end with integration, it evolves. Requires sustained financial support for education, legal aid, community development. What we build now must serve generations not yet born." At First National Bank, they were initially met with skepticism from bank officials who had never encountered a safety deposit box access request involving inheritance of civil rights-era materials. But Sarah's academic credentials and their documentation of Jeremiah's estate proved sufficient to gain them supervised access to Box 247A. The box contained documents that reframed everything they thought they understood about Jeremiah Mercer's activities. Legal papers showed that he had established multiple trust funds and charitable foundations, all of them designed to operate in perpetuity for civil rights and social justice causes. There were contracts with investment firms, correspondence with attorneys specializing in charitable giving, and most remarkably, a detailed plan for what he called the Reconciliation Project. The Reconciliation Project, as outlined in Jeremiah's meticulous notes, was his vision for using accumulated civil rights money to address ongoing racial disparities through education, community development, and economic empowerment programs. The plan included specific provisions for establishing scholarship funds, supporting minority-owned businesses, and funding community centers in underserved areas. But the most shocking discovery was a sealed envelope marked for Family Eyes Only Emergency Protocols. Inside were documents showing that Jeremiah had been aware his activities were under surveillance by both local authorities and federal agencies who viewed his civil rights support with suspicion and hostility. He knew they were watching him, Sarah said, studying FBI correspondence that suggested Jeremiah's phones had been tapped and his financial transactions monitored. And he knew that someday there might be retaliation against him or his family. Danny found the most disturbing document, a letter dated just 3 months before the mansion fire, written in Jeremiah's handwriting, but with the shaky quality of someone under extreme stress. "They know," the letter read. "Local authorities, probably federal as well. The questions are getting more specific, the pressure more intense. If something happens to me, if there's an accident or incident, the family must know this wasn't random. The work must continue, but carefully, quietly, until the time is right to bring it into the open." The implication was clear. Jeremiah had suspected that the fire which destroyed his mansion wasn't accidental, but deliberate retaliation for his civil rights activities. The letter included specific instructions for his descendants, detailing how to access the hidden funds and continue his work while avoiding the same dangers that had threatened him. On the drive back to Millbrook, they rode in contemplative silence, each processing the weight of what they'd learned. The money in the underground chamber wasn't just an inheritance, it was a sacred trust, accumulated over decades by people who had sacrificed their comfort and safety to support the cause of justice. "Dad," Danny said quietly as they approached the Millbrook city limits, "those developers who want to buy our land, do you think they know about any of this?" "I'm starting to think they know more than they're letting on," Eli replied. "The timing of their offer, their knowledge of our financial situation, the veiled threats, it's all too convenient to be coincidence." Sarah nodded grimly. "If there are people in this community who profited from suppressing civil rights activities 60 years ago, they wouldn't want this history to come to light. Your grandfather's story could expose things they've spent decades trying to keep buried." As they pulled into the estate's overgrown driveway, they noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud, multiple vehicles that had clearly been there recently. The mansion ruins showed signs of disturbance, and the entrance to the underground chamber had been partially excavated, though it appeared their nighttime visitors had been unsuccessful in gaining access to the tunnels. "Someone's been here," Eli said, his protective instincts immediately alert. Someone who knew exactly where to look. They approached the chamber entrance cautiously, finding evidence that sophisticated equipment had been used in an attempt to break through the concealment panel. Tool marks in the stone suggested professional-grade excavation equipment, and footprints in the disturbed earth indicated at least 3 people had been involved in the effort. Most disturbing was a typed note left prominently on top of the collapsed foundation where they couldn't miss it. "Some history is better left buried. Some treasures aren't worth finding. Consider this friendly advice from concerned neighbors." As they stood looking at the note, Eli realized their investigation had entered a new and potentially dangerous phase. The discovery of Jeremiah's underground archive was no longer a private family matter. It had attracted the attention of people with resources, determination, and apparently no qualms about trespassing and intimidation. "We need help," Sarah said, voicing what they were all thinking. "This is bigger than the 3 of us can handle alone." Your grandfather built a network of supporters and allies. Maybe some of them are still alive, still willing to help protect what he died trying to preserve. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, one of the handwritten letters they'd found in Jeremiah's archive, dated 1968 and signed simply M.W. The letter thanked Jeremiah for continued support during the most difficult period of our struggle and included a return address in downtown Atlanta. Sarah's research skills proved invaluable in tracking down the letter's author. Using city directories, voting records, and church membership lists, she identified M.W. as Marcus Washington, now 87 years old and living in a retirement community just outside Atlanta. More importantly, he was not only still alive, but had served as a prominent civil rights attorney for over 50 years. When they called, Marcus Washington's voice carried the weight of age, but none of its frailty. "Jeremiah Mercer's grandson?" he said, his tone immediately shifting to one of deep respect. "Young man, your grandfather was one of the bravest men I ever knew. We've been wondering for 60 years what happened to his archives." The next day, they drove to Atlanta to meet with Marcus at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he still served as an elder despite his advanced age. He was waiting for them in the church library, a distinguished man with silver hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of someone who had witnessed history firsthand. "Your grandfather saved lives," Marcus said simply, after examining the photographs and documents they'd brought. Not just through his Underground Railroad activities, but through his financial support for legal cases, bail funds, and protection for activists whose families were threatened. He pulled out a worn photo album and showed them images from the 1960s peaceful protests, voter registration drives, and legal proceedings that had helped dismantle institutional segregation. In several of the photographs, a younger Marcus Washington stood alongside other civil rights leaders, and in the background of one image, barely visible but unmistakable, was Jeremiah Mercer. He insisted on staying in the background, Marcus explained, said the work was more important than recognition, but without his support, many of our most important legal victories would have been impossible. Danny studied the photographs with intense concentration, clearly trying to reconcile this heroic image with his previously held understanding of his great-grandfather. "Why didn't anyone know about this? Why didn't he tell our family what he was really doing?" Marcus's expression grew somber. "Because it was dangerous, son. More dangerous than you might realize, even today. Your grandfather received death threats, had his business boycotted, was investigated by local and federal authorities who saw civil rights support as potentially treasonous activity. He protected his family by keeping them separate from his activism. But it was the coded letter from 1963 that Marcus helped them fully understand. The letter, written in what appeared to be a simple business correspondence about crop rotation and farming techniques, was actually a detailed status report on Underground Railroad activities throughout the Southeast. 17 bushels of corn delivered to northern markets, Marcus read aloud, translating the code with practiced ease. 17 people safely relocated to northern cities. The soil conditions remained favorable, meaning local authorities hadn't discovered the operation. Recommend expanding the South 40 acres, suggesting they should extend their network into new territory. Marcus explained that such coded communications were essential because mail was routinely intercepted and phone conversations monitored. Your grandfather developed one of the most sophisticated communication networks in the region. He could coordinate complex operations involving dozens of people across multiple states, all while appearing to conduct routine agricultural business. The final piece of the puzzle came when Marcus examined the specific coordinates and property descriptions in Jeremiah's final letter. His face grew thoughtful as he cross-referenced the information with maps and documents from his own extensive archives. "These aren't just hiding places," he realized. "Your grandfather was documenting every safe house, every financial supporter, every person who risked their safety to help the cause." This is a complete historical record of Underground Railroad activities that historians have been trying to reconstruct for decades. More importantly, Marcus recognized several of the names and addresses in Jeremiah's records, people who were still alive, still living in the Millbrook area, still potentially at risk if their past activities were exposed to the wrong people. Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, who ran the boarding house on Maple Street, Marcus said, pointing to an entry in the coded letter. She's 93 now, lives with her daughter, but she provided housing for dozens of travelers in the 1960s. And Pastor William Thompson at Mount Olive Baptist Church, his father, used the church basement as a meeting point for voter registration planning. Sarah took careful notes as Marcus identified person after person whose families had supported civil rights activities in ways that had never been publicly acknowledged. Many of these families still lived in Millbrook, their descendants integrated into the community's social and economic structure without anyone realizing their historical significance. This explains why some people might be so determined to keep this history buried. Sarah said, "If the truth came out about who really supported civil rights and who opposed it, it would rewrite the entire social structure of Millbrook." Marcus nodded gravely. "And it would also reveal who profited from maintaining segregation, who used intimidation and violence to suppress voting rights, who collaborated with authorities to undermine peaceful protests. Some of those people are still alive, still influential, still benefiting from the status quo they helped create." As they prepared to leave Atlanta, Marcus gave them a final piece of advice that would prove crucial in the days ahead. "Your grandfather's greatest achievement wasn't the money he donated or even the lives he saved," he said. "It was the network of relationships. He built people who trusted each other enough to risk everything for justice. That network still exists, though it's been dormant for decades. If you're going to honor his legacy, you'll need to reactivate those connections." He provided them with a list of contacts, children and grandchildren of original civil rights supporters, many of whom had no idea of their family's historical significance. "Start with Dorothy Jenkins," he advised. "She was your grandfather's closest local ally, and she knows where all the bodies are buried, so to speak." The drive back to Millbrook was filled with planning and preparation. They now understood that their inheritance was far more complex than hidden money or buried treasure. They were custodians of a historical record that could transform their community's understanding of its own past, but only if they could protect it from people who had spent 60 years ensuring that understanding never emerged. "Dad," Danny said as they approached the familiar Millbrook city limits, "are we really going to do this? Are we going to tell everyone the truth about what Great-Grandpa did?" Eli looked at his son in the rearview mirror, seeing in the boy's eyes a maturity that hadn't been there just weeks before. Danny had discovered that his family legacy included genuine heroism, that his great-grandfather had risked everything to stand up for justice when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent. "I think we have to," Eli said, "not just because of the money, but because the truth matters. Because the people who helped your great-grandfather deserve to have their courage remembered, and the people who oppose them need to be held accountable for that choice." Sarah checked her notes one final time before they reached the estate. "Marcus is right about reactivating the network, but we need to be careful about who we contact first. If word gets back to the wrong people that we're investigating this history, we could put ourselves and others in danger." As they pulled into the estate driveway, they noticed immediately that something had changed. The entrance to the underground chamber had been completely excavated, with professional-grade equipment still visible around the site. But more troubling was the presence of several official-looking vehicles parked near the mansion ruins, including what appeared to be a county inspector's truck and a surveyor's van. Standing near the vehicles, clipboard in hand and expression grim, was Richard Caldwell from the development company, along with two men in suits they didn't recognize. When Caldwell saw their car approaching, he smiled in a way that suggested he held all the advantages in whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Mr. Mercer," he called out as they parked. "Perfect timing. We need to discuss some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding your property ownership and the recent unauthorized excavation activities on this site." Requested. The men in suits introduced themselves as county building inspectors, armed with official documents declaring the property an archaeological hazard, requiring immediate professional assessment. Their legal authority seemed ironclad, backed by county ordinances about disturbed historical sites and environmental impact assessments that would take months to complete. "Unfortunately, Mr. Mercer," the lead inspector said with practiced bureaucratic sympathy, "until these assessments are finished, you're prohibited from accessing the underground areas you've apparently excavated. For safety reasons, of course." Eli felt the trap closing around them, understanding now that their opponents had resources and connections that went far beyond simple real estate development. This wasn't just about buying land, it was about controlling access to historical information that could reshape the community's understanding of its own past. But it was Danny who made the discovery that changed everything. While the adults argued about permits and legal procedures, the boy had wandered toward the mansion ruins, ostensibly to take more photographs, but actually to conduct his own investigation of the suspicious excavation equipment. "Dad," he called out, his voice carrying a note of excitement that cut through the tense adult conversation. "You need to see this." Hidden beneath a tarp near the surveyor's van, Danny had found boxes of documents, photocopies of the very materials they'd discovered in Jeremiah's underground chamber. Someone had been systematically copying the archive, creating their own record of the civil rights network while attempting to deny Eli and his family access to their own inheritance. But more shocking was the notebook Danny found in one of the boxes, written in a familiar handwriting that made Eli's blood run cold. The notebook contained detailed observations about the Mercer family's activities, their visits to the estate, their meetings with Sarah Matthews, even their trip to Atlanta to meet Marcus Washington. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather Jeremiah, but the dates were all recent within the past 2 months. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed, examining the notebook with trembling hands. "Jeremiah died 8 months ago. I attended his funeral." Eli stared at the handwriting, comparing it to the historical documents they'd been studying. There was no doubt, despite subtle changes that suggested advanced age and perhaps illness, this was definitely his grandfather's distinctive script. Richard Caldwell noticed their discovery and approached with an expression that had shifted from smugness to something approaching panic. "You shouldn't be looking through official investigation materials," he said, reaching for the notebook. "Official investigation materials, written by a man who's supposed to be dead," Eli challenged, holding the notebook out of Caldwell's reach. That's when the truth began to emerge, piece by piece, through a combination of confrontation and revelation that left everyone involved reeling from the implications. Jeremiah Mercer was not dead. The funeral had been staged, the death certificate falsified, all as part of an elaborate plan to protect himself from escalating threats, while ensuring his civil rights archive could be safely transferred to the next generation. He had been living in hiding for 8 months, monitoring his family's investigation from a distance, ensuring they were capable of handling the responsibility they were inheriting. The man who emerged from the surveyor's van was older, frailer, and moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose health had been seriously compromised, but he was undeniably Jeremiah Mercer. At 89, he looked every one of his years, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most effective civil rights supporters of his generation. "Hello, Eli," he said quietly. "I see you've been busy." The reunion was surreal, overwhelming, and filled with emotions that had been accumulating for decades of misunderstanding and estrangement. Eli had to sit down on a piece of debris, struggling to process the reality that his grandfather, a man he'd believed was dead, A man he'd spent years resenting for his apparent coldness and indifference was not only alive, but had been orchestrating events to ensure Eli would discover the truth about their family's legacy. Why? Was all Eli could manage to ask. Because the threats were real, Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the weight of age but none of its uncertainty. Because there are people in this community who would do anything to prevent this history from coming to light. Because I needed to know that you were strong enough, committed enough to carry on the work without putting yourself and Danny in unnecessary danger. Danny approached his great-grandfather with the curiosity of youth, overcoming the shock of the impossible. You've been watching us this whole time? Every step, Jeremiah confirmed, with a smile that transformed his weathered features. I'm very proud of how thorough your investigation has been, how carefully you've documented everything, how you've built alliances with people like Sarah and Marcus Washington. You've proven yourselves worthy of this inheritance. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Jeremiah explained that the fire which destroyed the mansion hadn't been accidental, nor had it been set by his enemies. He had arranged it himself, as part of an elaborate plan to fake his own death, while ensuring that the underground archive would be discovered by his descendants in a way that would prepare them for the responsibilities they were inheriting. The house was old, expensive to maintain, and too visible for the kind of work that still needs to be done, he explained. But the real history was always underground, always protected. The fire was simply a way to redirect attention while ensuring you would eventually find what I needed you to find. Richard Caldwell and his associates had been part of Jeremiah's plan from the beginning, hired to apply pressure that would force Eli to investigate the property more thoroughly, to make the inheritance seem threatened in ways that would motivate deeper exploration. They don't know about the real archive, Jeremiah explained. They think they're looking for hidden money, maybe some old family documents. They have no idea about the scope of what we actually accomplished, or what we're planning to accomplish going forward. The revelation reframed everything: the developers' pressure, the official inspections, even the threats and intimidation. It had all been theater, designed to create the circumstances that would lead Eli and Danny to discover not just their family's hidden history, but their own capacity for courage and commitment to justice. But now came the real test. With the truth revealed and the family reunited, they faced the actual decision that would determine their future. The civil rights money was real, the historical archive was genuine, and the responsibility to continue Jeremiah's work was now theirs, to accept or reject. The choice is yours, Jeremiah said, looking directly at his grandson and great-grandson. You can take the money, pay off your debts, start fresh somewhere new, and let this history remain buried. Or you can accept the calling that comes with this inheritance, knowing that it will change your lives in ways you can't yet imagine, and put you in opposition to people who have spent decades maintaining the status quo. Sarah, who had been silent throughout these revelations, finally spoke up. There's something else you should know. The people who were really opposed to your grandfather's work, the ones who made genuine threats, who used violence and intimidation to maintain segregation, some of them are still alive, still influential, still determined to keep this history buried. If you decide to go public with this archive, you'll be challenging power structures that have existed for generations. Danny looked at his father with eyes that held new understanding of what courage actually meant. This wasn't just about money or family legacy. It was about choosing between comfort and justice, between safety and truth, between inheriting wealth and inheriting responsibility. What do you think, Dad? Danny asked. What would Great-Grandpa really want us to do? The decision came easier than Eli had expected, emerging from a clarity that felt like finally understanding who he was meant to be. Looking at his son's hopeful face, his grandfather's expectant eyes, and Sarah's encouraging nod, he realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were simply recognitions of what had always been true. We continue the work, Eli said simply. Whatever the cost, whatever the risks, this money belongs to the cause, and the cause isn't finished. Jeremiah's relief was visible, years of careful planning finally validated by his family's decision to honor their inherited responsibility. Then we need to move quickly. The people I've been hiding from the real opponents, not Caldwell's theatrical pressure. They've suspected something was happening since the fire. If we're going to go public with this archive, we need to do it in a way that protects everyone involved and ensures the historical record can't be suppressed or distorted. The next 3 weeks became a whirlwind of preparation that tested every skill Eli had developed as a contractor and Danny had learned as a student. They were essentially organizing the most significant historical revelation in Millbrook's modern history, while simultaneously preparing to distribute nearly $400 million in ways that would honor the original donors' intentions. Sarah coordinated with historians and journalists from major newspapers, ensuring that the story would break simultaneously across multiple platforms, making it impossible to suppress or discredit. Marcus Washington connected them with surviving civil rights veterans who could provide context and validation for the archive's contents. But the most delicate work involved reaching out to the families whose ancestors had supported Jeremiah's Underground Railroad network. Many of these descendants had no idea of their family's historical involvement, and revealing their parents' or grandparents' civil rights activities could potentially put them at risk from the same forces that had made Jeremiah fake his own death. Dorothy Jenkins, now 93 and living with her daughter in a modest house on the east side of Millbrook, proved to be both a crucial ally and a sobering reminder of how dangerous this work had been. When Eli and Danny visited her, she initially refused to discuss the past, her eyes darting nervously toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Some stones are better left unturned," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of careful silence. "Some of us learned to survive by forgetting what we knew, by pretending we hadn't seen what we saw." But when they showed her photographs from Jeremiah's archive, images of her own boarding house being used as a safe haven, letters of gratitude from families she'd helped, financial records showing Jeremiah's payments for food and shelter provided to travelers, her resistance began to crumble. "Lord, help me," she whispered, holding a photograph that showed her as a young woman, standing beside Jeremiah and several civil rights activists in what had been her backyard. "I never thought I'd see these pictures again. Your grandfather promised me they'd been destroyed." Danny, who had become remarkably skilled at interviewing elderly sources, asked gently, "Mrs. Jenkins, what were you afraid would happen if people knew what you'd done?" Her answer revealed the depth of fear that had shaped decades of silence. "Child, you have to understand this wasn't just about disagreeing with segregation. This was about defying people who had the power to destroy your life, your family's livelihood, your safety. People who owned the banks, controlled the jobs, decided who could live where and work where, and send their children to school where." She described incidents of intimidation, violence, and economic retaliation against families suspected of supporting civil rights activities. Houses burned under suspicious circumstances, businesses boycotted into bankruptcy, families forced to leave town in the middle of the night for their own safety. "Your grandfather understood the risks better than most," she continued. "He had resources, connections, ways to protect himself that the rest of us didn't have. But even he knew that someday there might be a reckoning." As they prepared for the public revelation of the archive, similar conversations were happening throughout Millbrook and the surrounding communities. Elderly residents who had maintained decades of silence were being asked to step forward and acknowledge their families' roles in one of the most significant civil rights operations in Georgia's history. Some, like Dorothy Jenkins, eventually agreed to participate, understanding that their testimony would be crucial to validating the historical record. Others remained too frightened, too traumatized by past experiences to risk exposure even now. Pastor William Thompson, whose father had allowed Mount Olive Baptist Church to be used for voter registration planning, struggled with his own decision about going public. "My father made me promise never to talk about what happened in our church basement," he told Eli during a private meeting. He said, "There were people who would never forgive us, never forget, who would wait 50 years for revenge, if that's what it took. But it was Danny who helped convince many of the reluctant participants to share their stories. His youth, his obvious sincerity, and his deep respect for their experiences made him an effective advocate for historical truth. Mr. Thompson," he said during their conversation, "what if we don't tell these stories? What if another 50 years goes by and all the people who remember are gone? Won't that mean the people who tried to stop justice actually won?" Meanwhile, Jeremiah was working with a team of lawyers and financial advisors to structure the distribution of the inherited civil rights funds in ways that would maximize their impact while minimizing opportunities for corruption or misuse. The money would be used to establish educational scholarships, support minority-owned businesses, fund legal aid for civil rights cases, and create community development programs in underserved areas. But more than just distributing money, they were planning to establish a permanent civil rights education center on the Mercer Estate property, using the underground chambers as the foundation for a museum that would tell the complete story of the Underground Railroad network and its lasting impact on the community. The revelation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning press conference at Mount Olive Baptist Church, chosen both for its historical significance and its symbolic importance as a place where the community had gathered for decades to address issues of justice and reconciliation. 3 days before the scheduled announcement, they received their first serious threat, not the theatrical intimidation that had been part of Jeremiah's elaborate test, but a genuine warning that carried the weight of real danger behind it. The message was delivered through Dorothy Jenkins, who called Sarah in tears after finding an envelope slipped under her door during the night. "They know," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "They know what we're planning, and they're not going to let it happen." The envelope contained photographs, recent surveillance photos of Eli and Danny at the estate, of Sarah at the library, of Marcus Washington at his church in Atlanta. The message was clear. "We know who you are, where you live, what you're doing." But more chilling was the typed note that accompanied the photographs. "Some history lessons are too dangerous to teach. Some family legacies are too shameful to claim. Cancel your press conference. Return the money to its rightful owners, and no one gets hurt. Continue with your plans, and you'll discover that accidents can happen to anyone, even children." The threat against Danny made Eli's decision for him. He was prepared to take risks with his own safety, but putting his son in danger was unacceptable. He called an emergency meeting with Jeremiah, Sarah, and Marcus to discuss canceling the public revelation and finding a quieter way to honor the civil rights legacy. But it was Jeremiah who provided the perspective that changed Eli's mind. "If we back down now," the old man said, "we prove that intimidation still works, that courage is still for sale, that the people who opposed justice 60 years ago were right to believe they could suppress the truth indefinitely." He pulled out a folder containing letters and documents they hadn't seen before, correspondence from the original civil rights donors, people who had contributed their life savings to support the cause of justice, many of whom had faced their own threats and dangers for their involvement. "These people didn't give their money so it could be hidden forever," Jeremiah continued. "They gave it believing it would be used to continue the fight for justice, even when that fight became difficult or dangerous. If we abandon that mission now because of threats, we dishonor every sacrifice that made this inheritance possible." Danny, who had been listening quietly to the adult conversation, finally spoke up with a maturity that reminded everyone that this decision would shape his understanding of courage for the rest of his life. "Great-grandpa," he said, "what did you do when people threatened you 60 years ago?" "We kept working," Jeremiah replied simply. "We became more careful, more strategic, but we didn't stop. Because the cause was bigger than our individual safety, and the people depending on us deserved better than our fear." Danny nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. Then that's what we do now. We keep working, but we're smarter about it. That evening, as they finalized their plans for the press conference, Eli realized that his son had learned something far more valuable than the location of hidden treasure. Danny had discovered that real courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act according to your principles, even when fear was present. The revelation was still scheduled for Tuesday morning, but now they understood it wouldn't be just a historical announcement. It would be a test of whether justice could still triumph over intimidation, whether truth could survive the efforts of those who profited from its suppression. Tuesday morning arrived grey and humid, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the turbulence ahead. Mount Olive Baptist Church filled steadily throughout the early morning hours, drawing a crowd that reflected the complex racial and social dynamics of Millbrook in ways that hadn't been seen since the civil rights era itself. Eli stood in the pastor's study, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly despite his determination to see this through. Through the window, he could see news vans from Atlanta and Savannah, their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers, seeking signals that would carry this story far beyond the boundaries of their small community. Danny sat at the pastor's desk, making final notes in the evidence journal that had become his constant companion throughout their investigation. At 12 years old, he was about to become the youngest person ever to address a press conference about civil rights history, but his focus remained steady and purposeful. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you scared?" Eli considered the question seriously, recognizing that his answer would help shape how his son understood courage for the rest of his life. "Yes," he admitted, "but being scared doesn't mean we stop doing what's right. It just means we're careful about how we do it." Sarah entered the study carrying a box of documents and photographs that would serve as evidence for their revelations. Her face showed the strain of 3 weeks of intensive preparation, but her eyes held the satisfaction of a scholar about to share a discovery that would rewrite local history. "The church is full," she reported. "Local residents, historians from the university, reporters from major newspapers, and—" She paused, her expression growing concerned. "Several people I don't recognize, men in expensive suits who look like they're here for reasons that have nothing to do with historical interest." And Jeremiah appeared in the doorway, moving slowly, but with the dignity of someone who had waited 8 decades to tell this story publicly. In his hands, he carried the original journal from 1963, its pages yellowed, but its message as powerful as the day it was written. "It's time," he said simply. The sanctuary of Mount Olive Baptist Church had been transformed for the occasion, with a podium set up at the front and display boards showing enlarged photographs from the Civil Rights Archive. As the Mercer family entered, conversations gradually quieted until the only sounds were the clicking of camera shutters and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. Pastor Thompson, whose own family's involvement in the Underground Railroad network would be revealed today, offered a brief prayer for wisdom, courage, and healing. Then he introduced Jeremiah Mercer as a man who chose justice over comfort, truth over safety, and legacy over personal gain. Jeremiah approached the podium slowly, his aged hands gripping the wooden surface for support as he looked out over the assembled crowd. His voice, when he began to speak, carried clearly through the sanctuary despite his age. 60 years ago, he said, "I made a decision that shaped the rest of my life and the future of this community. I decided that my wealth, my resources, my connections would be used to support the cause of justice, even when that choice put me at odds with friends, neighbors, and family members who preferred to maintain the status quo." He described the Underground Railroad network, the financial support for civil rights activities, the careful documentation that had preserved this history for future generations. But he also acknowledged the fear that had led him to keep these activities secret for decades, the threats that had forced him to fake his own death, the ongoing dangers faced by families who had supported the cause. As Jeremiah spoke, enlarged photographs appeared on screens throughout the sanctuary, images of young African-American men and women who had found refuge in Millbrook safe houses, documents showing financial support for voter registration drives, correspondence with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders. The crowd's reaction was mixed but intense. Some faces showed surprise and admiration as they learned about their community's hidden role in civil rights history. Others reflected anger or discomfort as the carefully maintained narrative of local racial relations was challenged by documented evidence of both courageous support and violent opposition. When Jeremiah finished his testimony, he called Eli to the podium to announce the establishment of the Mercer Civil Rights Education Foundation, funded by the nearly $400 million that had been accumulated over 5 decades of careful investment. "This money doesn't belong to the Mercer family," Eli said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "It belongs to the cause that originally inspired its collection, the ongoing work of justice, education, and reconciliation. It will be used to support scholarships for students who might not otherwise have access to higher education, to fund legal aid for civil rights cases, and to establish community programs that address the lasting effects of systemic inequality." But as Eli described their plans for the Civil Rights Education Center, he noticed movement in the back of the sanctuary that made his protective instincts alert. Several of the unidentified men Sarah had mentioned were making their way toward the exits, speaking quietly into cell phones, with expressions that suggested urgent coordination with unseen associates. The first sign of real trouble came when the church's power suddenly went out, plunging the sanctuary into the gray twilight of the storm-darkened morning. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the sanctuary, casting eerie shadows that transformed the familiar church interior into something resembling a stage set for confrontation. Pastor Thompson's voice cut through the murmur of concerned congregation members. "Please remain calm. We have backup generators that should restore full power momentarily." But Eli's construction experience told him this wasn't a random power failure. The timing was too convenient, the selective nature of the outage too precise. Someone had deliberately cut power to the church while leaving the surrounding neighborhood unaffected. Danny moved closer to his father, clutching his evidence journal with both hands. "Dad, something's wrong." Before Eli could respond, the sanctuary's rear doors burst open, and 6 men in dark clothing entered with the coordinated movement of people executing a planned operation. They weren't wearing masks or making dramatic announcements. They simply spread out across the back of the church with the quiet efficiency of professionals who intended to control the situation through presence and intimidation. The lead man, older than the others and carrying himself with obvious authority, walked slowly down the center aisle toward the podium. His face was familiar. Eli recognized him from old newspaper photographs in Sarah's research files. This was Robert Whitfield, now in his 70s, whose family had controlled much of Millbrook's economic development for generations and whose grandfather had been one of the most vocal opponents of civil rights activities in the 1960s. "Mr. Mercer," Whitfield said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent sanctuary, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of your family's historical activities." Jeremiah straightened behind the podium, his aged frame taking on the dignity of someone who had faced this kind of confrontation before and survived. "Robert, I wondered when you'd finally show yourself. Your family has been spreading some very interesting stories about the past," Whitfield continued, ignoring the obvious tension in the room. "Stories that could be damaging to long-standing community relationships, that could disrupt the social stability that has served Millbrook well for decades." Sarah, who had been standing near the display boards, stepped forward with the courage of an academic defending her research. "These aren't stories, Mr. Whitfield. These are documented historical facts, supported by primary sources, photographs, and financial records that can be independently verified. Whitfield's smile was cold and calculating. "Miss Matthews, I'm afraid your research has led you to some unfortunate conclusions. The documents you've been examining, particularly those found in the underground chambers, were planted there recently as part of an elaborate hoax designed to extract money from gullible investors and historically naive researchers." The accusation hung in the air like poison, designed to undermine everything they had discovered and documented. But it was Danny who responded with the devastating clarity of youth, unencumbered by adult politics and social complications. "That's impossible," the boy said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "We have carbon dating results on the paper, ink analysis that confirms the age of the documents, and independent verification from multiple sources, including Dr. Marcus Washington in Atlanta." Whitfield's expression tightened as he realized he was being challenged by a 12-year-old whose research skills exceeded those of many adults. "Son, you're too young to understand how easily documents can be forged, how historical evidence can be manufactured by people with specific political agendas." But Marcus Washington himself chose that moment to enter the sanctuary, having driven from Atlanta specifically to support the Mercer family's revelations. At 87, he moved slowly but with unmistakable dignity, and his presence immediately shifted the balance of authority in the room. "Robert Whitfield," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience and moral authority, "I remember your grandfather. I remember the threats he made, the violence he endorsed, the families he forced to leave town in the middle of the night. And I remember your father, who continued those same practices into the 1970s and 80s. Marcus approached the podium and stood beside Jeremiah, creating a visual representation of the alliance that had made their civil rights work possible decades earlier. "Everything the Mercer family has revealed today is true. I have my own documentation, my own photographs, my own records that corroborate every aspect of their account." The confrontation might have escalated into violence, but the presence of news cameras and journalists throughout the sanctuary created a constraint that even Whitfield's associates recognized. Whatever their intentions, carrying out threats in front of multiple media outlets would create problems that extended far beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Instead, Whitfield made a strategic withdrawal, but not before delivering a final warning that everyone understood as a promise rather than a threat. "This isn't over, Mercer. You've chosen to make this community's private business into a public spectacle, and there will be consequences for that choice. Some truths are too dangerous to tell, and some legacies are too valuable to be destroyed by misguided idealism." As Whitfield and his associates left the sanctuary, the lights suddenly returned, as if their departure had somehow restored the natural order of things. But everyone present understood that the real confrontation was just beginning, that revealing the truth about Millbrook's civil rights history would require sustained courage rather than just the dramatic gesture of a single morning's announcement. 1 year later, the transformation of both the Mercer estate and the community of Millbrook had exceeded everyone's expectations, though the journey had been neither smooth nor without significant challenges. The Mercer Civil Rights Education Center occupied the site where the mansion ruins had once stood, its modern design incorporating preserved elements of the underground chambers that now served as the centerpiece of an interactive museum. School groups from across Georgia made regular visits to learn about the Underground Railroad network that had operated beneath their feet for decades without their knowledge. Eli stood in the center's main exhibition hall, watching his son Danny guide a group of middle school students through a display of photographs and documents that told the complete story of their community's civil rights history. At 13, Danny had become one of the center's most effective educational ambassadors, able to connect with young visitors in ways that adult historians sometimes couldn't match. The important thing to understand, Danny was telling the visiting students, is that the heroes of this story weren't famous people or professional activists. They were ordinary families who decided that doing the right thing was more important than staying safe or maintaining their social status. Dorothy Jenkins, now 94 but still sharp-minded, sat in her wheelchair near the display, occasionally adding details that brought the historical accounts to life with personal memories. Her decision to go public with her family's involvement had inspired other elderly residents to share their own stories, creating a comprehensive oral history archive that preserved experiences that would otherwise have been lost forever. "Child, you tell them about Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," she encouraged Danny. "Tell them how we used to signal each other with different colored curtains in our windows, and how the whole neighborhood could coordinate without ever saying a word about what we were doing." The Mercer Civil Rights Foundation had distributed nearly $200 million in its first year of operation, funding scholarships that allowed dozens of local students to attend college, supporting minority-owned businesses throughout the region, and providing legal aid for civil rights cases that addressed ongoing inequalities in education, employment, and housing. But perhaps more importantly, the Foundation's community dialogue programs had begun to bridge racial and economic divisions that had persisted for generations. Monthly forums brought together residents from different backgrounds to discuss local issues, historical legacies, and opportunities for cooperation that had never existed before. Sarah Matthews had left her position at the Millbrook Library to become the Education Center's Director of Research and Programming. Her office, located in what had once been Jeremiah's underground archive chamber, was now filled with donated materials from families throughout the region who had discovered their own connections to civil rights activities. The most surprising thing, Sarah told a visiting journalist from the Atlanta Constitution, is how many people have come forward with stories and documents once they realized it was safe to talk about these things. "We've documented Underground Railroad activities in 17 counties, involving over 200 families whose contributions had never been officially recognized." Jeremiah, now 90 but still actively involved in the Foundation's work, spent most afternoons at the center sharing stories with visitors and occasionally surprising school groups who couldn't believe they were meeting someone who had actually lived through the events they were studying. The money was never the real treasure, he told one group of high school students. The real treasure was learning that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they decided that justice was worth the risk. The opposition to the center's work had not disappeared entirely. Robert Whitfield and his associates had challenged the Foundation's tax-exempt status, questioned the authenticity of historical documents, and used their influence to limit the center's access to certain official records. But their efforts had been largely unsuccessful, particularly after Marcus Washington and other civil rights veterans provided corroborating testimony that validated the Mercer family's revelations. More significantly, the center's educational programs had begun to change how younger residents understood their community's history, creating a generation that was less willing to maintain old patterns of racial and economic segregation. Tommy Harrison, the boy who had once tormented Danny with gossip about the Mercer family's financial troubles, had become one of Danny's closest friends after learning that his own great-grandmother had worked as a seamstress, secretly altering clothes to help Underground Railroad travelers blend in with local populations. "It's weird," Tommy told Danny during one of their weekend visits to the center. "My family never talked about great-grandma's sewing work, but now we know she was basically a spy, helping people escape to freedom. Makes me think about what other secrets people in our families might be keeping." Eli's construction business had been transformed as well, now specializing in historically sensitive renovation projects throughout the Southeast. The skills he'd developed while excavating and preserving the underground chambers had made him one of the region's most sought-after contractors for civil rights preservation projects. But the most profound transformation had been in his relationship with Danny, who had emerged from their shared investigation with confidence, purpose, and a deep understanding of his family's legacy that would shape his entire life. On the anniversary of their first visit to the mansion ruins, father and son returned to the massive oak tree where they had discovered Jeremiah's blueprints. The tree now anchored the center's memorial garden, surrounded by plaques honoring the families who had risked their safety to support civil rights activities. A new plaque had been added recently, dedicating the garden to all those who chose courage over comfort, truth over silence, and justice over personal advantage. The inscription concluded with words from Jeremiah's original 1963 journal: "Future generations will understand what we did here, what we sacrificed. Let them know we were not just businessmen, we were freedom fighters." Danny read the inscription aloud, then looked at his father with eyes that held new understanding of what inheritance really meant. "Dad, do you think we've done what Great-Grandpa wanted us to do?" Eli put his arm around his son's shoulders, looking out over the education center, where school buses were already arriving with the next day's visitors, where researchers were uncovering new stories of courage and sacrifice, where young people were learning that history wasn't something that happened to other people in distant times, but something they were actively creating through their own choices and actions. "I think we've made a good start," Eli said. "But the real work, the work of justice and reconciliation, that's something every generation has to take on for themselves. We've just tried to make sure they'll have the resources and the knowledge they need to do it well." As they walked back toward the education center, Danny paused to photograph the garden one more time for his continuously growing documentation project. In the distance, thunder rumbled like an echo of the storm that had accompanied their first major revelation a year earlier, but the sound no longer carried any sense of threat or foreboding. The last garden had become the first garden, not an ending, but a beginning of something that would continue growing long after everyone involved in its planting had become part of the history that future generations would study, honor, and hopefully continue.